Isaiah tells us a story of a man who goes out and he plants a tree, and he comes back several years later and he cuts the tree down and he takes it back to his workshop. And he sets it up and he looks at it, he measures it with his tools, and he draws his line around it, and he says, no, I only need half of that wood. So he cuts the log in half, and he takes the half that he cuts off, and he splinters it up, and he makes his fire out of it to keep him warm while he's working. And while the fire is burning, he takes his hammer and his chisels, he takes his knife, and he cuts it, and he fashions an idol out of the remaining piece of wood. Now, it may be a little difficult to see, but what Isaiah is doing is he's building a logical argument to a logical conclusion. He's not just preaching, but he's teaching a very important lesson. And the craftsman gets, he's shaping this little wooden man, right? And he wants it to be powerful. So he puts big muscles on it, right? And he wants this little god to be smart, to know everything. So he puts eyes all around the little god's head so that wherever you look at it, the little god is looking back at you. How smart is that, right? And then he gets tired and he goes over to his fire and he bakes himself a loaf of bread with the wood that came off of the idol. He bakes himself a loaf of bread and he roasts meat and he eats it and he regains his strength and he goes back and he finishes his idol. And he wants it to be all powerful and manly and wise and great, and so he fashions it that way. And when he's done, he bows down and he worships his idol, right? And he says, oh, you are my God, save me from whatever calamity happens to be coming over the next hill. Save me from the Philistines. Save me from the Amalekites. Save me from the Assyrians. What Isaiah is saying is that this block of wood, which the man has formed, is no better than the other half of the wood which the man has burned. But there's another connection. The man pours himself into his idol. He decides what he thinks are good qualities. Right? He decides what he wants in his God. He doesn't want it to be a beautiful, creative woman. He wants it to be a powerful, virile man, right? So he makes decisions and he puts muscles on his God. He pours himself into the idol, and then he comes over to his fire and he eats of the bread that is cooked on the flame. And there is a circle where the heat from the idol wood comes through the bread and feeds the man, and the man pours himself back into the idol. And what is Isaiah saying? That's the whole circle. That's it. That's all the power this idol has. This is a detestable thing. Now, I suppose if we wanted to be vulgar, we could take the analogy one step further, because all of the energy that goes into baking the bread goes into the man, and then where does it go? It goes into the cat hole behind the tree where he covers it up with dirt. And that is the strength of the idol. Moses tells us in Exodus 20 that those who create idols will become like them. One of my favorite Bible teachers, a man named Chuck Missler, talked about traveling in Egypt. And he saw the people there worshipped the scarab. Has everyone seen Egyptian hieroglyphs where they have a beetle or a scarab, and that is their god, and they bow down and they worship this god? Well, Chuck's a pretty smart guy. So he did a little bit of research, just a little bit, and he found out that beetle is actually a dung beetle. It inhabits piles of manure left behind by passing animals. If you have a large animal, like a camel, you can feed a pretty decent amount of these beetles. Now, the Egyptians saw these beetles coming out of the manure as, the manure being the dead waste material. And the Egyptians saw life coming out of the manure, and they thought, well, this is a wonderful sign of rebirth of our God. And so they worshipped this dung beetle. But what does Moses say? Moses says those who fashion idols will become like them. And Chuck, in his travels in Egypt, noticed that the Egyptians who still worship the scarab live in garbage piles. They surround their homes with the waste, the trash, and the manure that produces their gods. So while their gods are living on these manure piles, so are the people who worship those gods. Okay. What was the Philistine god? The god of the Philistines. Peter taught us this in a lesson several weeks ago. The god of the Philistines was named? Ashtoreth was one of them. Ashtoreth was a fertility god. And when in the Bible you'll hear or you'll read about Asherah poles. King Solomon placed Asherah poles on a hill overlooking the temple. What is an Asherah pole? It's a tree carved to look like a male human organ. That is the god they were worshiping. But there was another Philistine god. It was Baal or Molech. Baal, as we learned a couple of weeks ago, was the rain god, right? He sent the rain and he sent the fire, and I guess it was 3 weeks ago at this point. Wow, time flies when you're having fun. And we learned that in Elijah's time there were prophets. There were Israelite prophets of Baal who turned their backs on the true God of Israel to worship him because they wanted the rain. Right? And they became like their God. Now, how does Baal end up in the story of the ark in 1 Samuel? That's the Hebrew, Samuel. Baal ends up flat on his face with his head and his hands broken off in front of the God of Israel. How do the 450 prophets of Baal end up? They end up lying face down in the mud with their heads removed. The same way the statue, the idol of Baal was. What are we learning about? We're learning about the idea that when you worship something, you become like that thing. When you worship a dung beetle, you live in a dump. When you worship a God who has no power, you yourself have no power. Okay, I don't know about you, but that thrills me. That fills me with hope and excitement because I worship the true and living God, the creator of the universe, the maker of everything that ever is or was or ever will be, seen and unseen. And I'm going to be like him. Paul tells us, now we see dimly as through a glass darkly, but then we shall see face to face because, folks, because Paul says, we shall be like him. You never thought the Ten Commandments could be so exciting, did you? I love that. So we've got Exodus 20. If I can find it again. I really ought to start bookmarking these. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sins of the fathers to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. This, I caught on this. This caught on me like a fish hook in my ear as I was reading it, because God says here, and he's writing these words with his own finger. He says right here, I will visit the sins of the fathers to the children of them that hate me, to the third and fourth generation. Now, are we responsible for the sins that our fathers have committed? No. No. God judges each of us for what we do or don't do in our own lives. Was Moses wrong when he wrote this? Let's turn, if we will, just quickly to Ezekiel chapter 18 and verse 20. Ezekiel, Jeremiah. It's not far after Isaiah. Maybe it is far after Isaiah. I'm sorry. Okay. Ezekiel chapter 18 and verse 20. And you don't have to worry about going and getting a Bible if we're only going to be here for the one verse. But Ezekiel 18:20 says, the soul who sins is the one who will die. The son will not share the guilt of the father, nor will the father share the guilt of the son. The righteousness of the wicked man, of the righteous man, will be credited to him, and the wickedness of the wicked man charged against him. What then does Moses mean? Or not Moses. What then does God mean when he says, I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sins of the fathers to the third and fourth generation can't cut that sentence off. To the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. Do Moses and Ezekiel seem to be contradicting each other? Ezekiel says the sins of the father will not be visited on the son. Moses says the sins of the father will be visited on the son. No, of course not. Anytime you find what appears to be a contradiction like this in the scriptures, that's the Holy Spirit poking you with a stick. Pay attention. There's a lesson to be learned here. Now, there are other spots like this as well. There's a proverb that says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, right? Yay! There's another proverb, same book, which says, he who increases wisdom increases sorrow. They seem to contradict, but do they? No. If we look at these from our real world experience, we see how they can often be the same when they seem to say completely the opposite. What do I mean? I'm reading a book right now for local pastors' licensing school by a woman named Roberta Bondi. And Roberta talks about how she grew up as a little girl in a very holiness-type Baptist church, and how they scared the britches off of her. How she was absolutely terrified of the men who stood in the pulpits and screamed and jumped and pounded on the pulpits, and she was afraid of her father because her father was full of wrath. That when she transgressed, he whipped the belt off and beat her. And then someone asks her to memorize the Lord's Prayer. And the Lord's Prayer begins, Our Father. And when Roberta got that far, she got angry. Why did she get angry? Because she associated her father and she associated her pastor with that role, the role of father. And those were men who terrified her. Those were men who hurt her and made her feel bad. So when she goes to God and says, Our Father, she said she couldn't get any further than that. She said it took her years of focused, intentional study, all the way through high school, all the way through college, all the way through graduate school. She was teaching at a college, and she still couldn't pray, Our Father. Eventually, she realized her mistake. Her mistake was that God was not like her father. Her mistake was that God was not like her pastor. That God was not a vengeful, angry man sitting on a cloud and waiting to destroy her the moment she messed up. And when she realized that, she was able to pray, Our Father. Now, why do I bring this up? Because the sins of the fathers are visited upon the third and fourth generation. What was Roberta's father's sin? It was wrath. It was anger. It was lack of compassion and a lack of empathy and a lack of understanding. Did Roberta suffer for the sin of her father? Yes, she did. She suffered most of her young adult life because whenever anyone attempted to place God in the role of a loving father, she just couldn't see it. She just couldn't see a loving father. The sins of the fathers are visited upon the children. Now, was that sin counted against Roberta? No, of course not. But she suffered under what her father had done. And she suffered a long time. So there is no contradiction between the Ezekiel passage and the Exodus passage. What's the takeaway? The takeaway is the last sentence of that commandment. Verse 6, Exodus chapter 20 and verse 6, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. If you love God, if you obey his commandments, and you train up your children in the way they should go, and you behave in a way that the people around you see that obedience and that love of God, that not only will you be blessed, but just like Roberta was cursed by the anger of her father, those around us will be blessed by our obedience to God. Now, can we be obedient if we worship something other than God? Does God want us living on dunghills? No. No. We obey even when we don't understand. Because God says, this is how you do it. God says, if you do these things, I will bless you, and I will bless 1,000 generations after you of those who love me and keep my commandments. Love God and obey him. The commandments are not burdensome. I often talk with a Messianic Jew, and I made the mistake once of saying, well, you have to keep the Torah, right? Because you're calling yourself a Jew. And he said, no. I get to keep the Torah. I get to obey. Strip the idols out of your life. Love and worship God and become like him. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, said there are two types or two aspects of salvation. One is justification, and that happens immediately the moment we accept Jesus. The other is sanctification. Sanctification happens across the rest of our lives. And it's a process of us becoming like Jesus. We become like what we worship. Worship him. Love, serve, obey. Be Jesus with shoes on. And when the world sees you, when the world sees the love that comes through you, we're going to need more chairs in the sanctuary. Amen.